professor, and my classes, I like to have interactions. I like to hear you talk, and I like to hear you respond to me, which turns the juices of me on. And if I ask a question, and just raise your hand, put your elbow above your head where I can see it. This is fun. This is fun. Learning is fun. Some of you may not think so, but learning is fun. In the last two classes, the last two sessions, I said that someone here told me that about the length of the classes and that I should make everything very short because your attention span is not very long. So I have to get it to you and you catch it and I move on. I think it's a little longer than just a little bit. So if I happen to, while I'm talking, if there is a question, hey, raise your hand and I'll try to address that question at the time. But if it's really important, or wait until the end. The topic, as Mr. Housen said, was about the civil rights era. That's the time that I grew up in. I grew up in a time during the late 50s, 60s. My college years were during the 60s. So that was a time when it was really, really hot so far as the South is concerned. And the South is really known for that period of time of what we call Jim Crow laws. Has anybody ever heard of Jim Crow? Okay. Good. Good. On this side, I'm going to talk about some areas, some periods of time during Jim Crow and what I went through. And I think this is what he talks about, an oral history in a sense. Let me explain one thing. I grew up in the South, North Florida. Anybody know what Tallahassee, Florida is? I grew up about 19, 20 miles from Tallahassee. So I had a chance to really see a lot of things that went on in Tallahassee. Tallahassee is a very unique town. And I call it a town because it's a big town. If you were to go down to Warrenton, Virginia, and look how Warrenton looks, just make it bigger, and that's Tallahassee, Florida, with the state capital. During my days, what was school like? What was school like? What did kids like myself do going to school? You've got to remember one thing, that I went to an all-black high school. Just like here in Alexandria, there was one high school in the county for blacks. Anybody know where that was? There was one black high school in the county. I didn't do that this morning. Anybody know what that black high school was, where it was? Any teachers?
Parker Gray.
That's Alexandria. That's Arlington. Understand this. Okay. I want you to imagine, just imagine, put on this hat of imagination. Just imagine. It is 1960, 1959, 1960. All black kids in Fairfax County went to one high school. One high school. They were bused from all over the county to one high school. And that was Luther Jackson. Luther Jackson High School. Anybody have an idea? It still exists as a building. I don't think it's an elementary school.
Middle school.
It's a middle school. Well, that's what it was like for me. I went to school, I caught a bus. There were 4 buses that went past my house every day. Every morning, afternoon. There were 2 black high school. The bus came by, picked me up, and there was another high school that was black that they were like this. And there were 2 white high schools that was like this. And there was a boundary line that says just about like some of you may live very close on the boundary lines for Mount Vernon and Edison High School. But across the street was Edison. On this side is West Potomac. That's the way it was while we had these high schools, different high schools. In school, we would get to school. We had no electronics. There was no computers. There was no cell phones. Matter of fact, most people out in the country didn't have phones, or if they did, they had a party line. And just about everybody that was on the party line could hear what you were talking about, so you know. So the only thing that we had in our high school that was electronic was the lights. Switch that hung from the middle of the room, so you had to reach out and pull it. That was it. Everything else was, we picked it up from our minds. I would sit and I would watch and I would take notes, and the bus ride for me was 17 miles. So I did a lot of homework on the bus going home. Because when I got home, I had something we call chores. I know everybody didn't know what that is. Stores. What was it like living in the South under Jim Crow? Since everybody know what Jim Crow is, or was, or is. In some cases, it still exists, if it's only mine. If I went to a store, I guess I was about 15 or 16 years old, I graduated from high school at 16. And I guess my junior and senior year was the first time I went to a store, tried on a suit, didn't like it, tried on another one, and bought it. Jim Crow says, that's a no-no. Not as a black youth, I could not go into a store, try on clothes, and put them back on the rack. If I tried them on, you bought it, even if it was too tight. I remember my mom would come and measure my feet on a piece of paper to try on shoes. And I would always get shoes too big and have to wear them for a long time. That's why I have so many corns on my feet today. Because Jim Crow. Because I couldn't try on shoes in the store. The attitudes were different. Attitudes were very, very different in terms of what went on during that time. There was a mental conditioning, and all of this started with Jim Crow. Jim Crow came about just after the Civil War, between the Reconstruction period of 1866 up through 1870, 1875. That's when many of the places began to really make the laws come into being. And Jim Crow is an offshoot of a system called slavery. And Jim Crow is a system that was implanted into a people for 400 years. So it became a conditioning. And I told a story this morning about my dad talking about what mental conditioning was. He talked about a father who had a son, and he was trying to, I forgot what the whole story was about, but I remember this part. Dad would come up and the son would pass by and he'd slap him upside the head. Ow! Every time he saw him, he would, wow, slap him upside the head. Go to dinner, sit down, slap him upside the head. So one day, Dad came home, kid walked by, he ducked his head. There was no slap upside the head. That's what you call conditioning. Jim Crow was based on fear. Fear. Fear enough to not to cause death to anybody in your family. One of the laws of Jim Crow was a black man could not stand up and talk to a white man and look him in the eye. Look him in the eye was dangerous. Could not shake his hand. Once a young man became 13 years old, regardless of how old the black man was, if he was 17 years old, he became Mr. And if you broke any of the laws, you could lose your job, you could be made to move, you could be hung for it, or some other thing that was really crazy. Sports, let's talk about sports. I grew up at a time when we had a very good basketball team. My earlier years, we had kids that were big. When I was in the 11th grade, I on the starting team, but I was the smallest in terms of height on the team. Everybody was around 6'7", 6'8", 6'9". And that's the way that it was with country boys. But we could never play an all-white team, a white school team. Never. Basketball, football, and those four schools that I talked about was, even though we rode 17 miles to school, they were only about 4 to 5 miles apart. Just like Mount Vernon. I think the farthest may have been West Springfield. So when there was what we call desegregation, when everybody came together, they came together for one high school. All of those schools came together for one high school. But we could never, ever participate. Another condition of Jim Crow. I had some of my best friends were white kids that we grew up together from 2 years old, 3 years old until we graduated from high school. So naturally, we always hung out together. We would get off the school buses, even though we went to different schools, we would jump up on our bicycle and end up, for some reason, all kids end up in our house. I've always wondered why. But there was a key behind it. There was a long road that passed our house. And as a car began to come past our house, even though we were outside shooting baskets, white kids ran. That's like turn a light on in a dark room with roaches. Everybody scattered. And the reason was we weren't supposed to be doing this. Because my dad, their dad, and mom could have gotten into serious trouble. I mean, serious trouble. We're talking about jail time trouble. We're talking about jail time trouble that maybe somebody didn't come back from jail, that just sort of disappeared. Question, a topic that I wanted to cover was, okay, Dr. Houston, here you are in 2015. What is the difference that you see now versus the difference that you saw as a teenager back in the 60s? What was it? What was it like seeing a protest? The first protest that I saw was in Albany, Georgia. This was around 1961, 62. I can't remember the exact time. But I was on a bus going to, I guess, Fort Valley, I guess. But there were, understand that when you're on the bus, I could not get off the bus and go to the bathroom, or I couldn't get off the bus and buy anything. But just imagine you are sitting on a bus and there are 500 people shaking your bus, calling you names, throwing eggs at the window, threatening to get on the bus and do some very bad bodily damage to you. What is that like versus today in Baltimore, in Ferguson, in New York? The big difference was during the period of time that I was growing up, we believed in nonviolence. That's what Martin Luther King preached. I mean, if you're going out and you're going to protest, you have to be able to stand there and take it. Well, I have to admit, and son, I didn't tell you this, but I couldn't do that. If you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. And I'll keep hitting you back until I get what I want. I want you to hurt you. So they had to get other folk who could do that. And I remember during college days, Fort Valley is a small town. And at the time we had something very close to 3,000 students at Fort Valley. And there was one movie. And in the movies in the South, blacks could not sit downstairs with whites. We had to sit upstairs. There were restaurants that we had to go to the back of the building to get our sandwiches. Well, now, here is about 3,000 kids who said, no, I'm not going to go. So I remember this day that we marched down to the movie house to go into the movie. And to our surprise, when we got there, the owner said, hey, you all come on in, come on in, come on in. I mean, he wasn't going to go against that. And I want to leave time for some questions. There's a lot of things that I want to cover, but I want to leave this with you. What are some departing words? What are some departing wisdoms? What are some things that I want you to remember from today? What is it? What is it? What should you remember? 4 things I want you to remember. Education. Education. Education is important to you. Education. Education will determine where you're going to raise your children. It's going to determine the kind of house you're going to live in. Education will determine what your income will be. Education will determine the kind of wife you're going to have, you're going to marry, or they marry you. And I can say this, ladies, you don't want a guy who don't have a job. Do you? Come on, speak up. Do you want to marry a guy who doesn't have a job? I don't think so. So guys, education is very, very, very important. Second thing, voting. Voting is extremely important because it tells you also what kind of job you're going to get, where you're going to live, what kind of car you're going to drive, because that's where laws are made. And if you don't vote, then you should not even raise a question of why things are happening the way they are. And most of all, for black youth in here, as well as white youth. Now get this now, I want to make sure you understand this. Not all white people in the South were bad. I remember Mr. Fegali, probably one of the nicest guys that I ever met. Dr. Reed was probably one of the nicest guys that I ever met. Dr. Reed was a veterinarian, and I wanted to become a veterinarian, and I went to school to become a veterinarian. So, voting is extremely important. Third thing, each one of you is responsible for the next generation. You are responsible for your grandchildren and what they are going to be, where they live, the kind of education they get, and all of the other stuff. You're responsible for it. So while you are here at West Potomac, it is important that you pay attention. And the last thing is take care of your parents and older folk. Take care of, because they are your history. They are your history. If you don't know where you've been, you have no idea where you're going. Now let me tell you about, go back to education, and I just want to hit a couple of points on it. That was a test that has been doing now since the early 50s, and it is done on the industrialized countries of the world. In the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the USA came up number 1 out of 67 countries. Number 1. That same test was applied in 2012, just about 3 years ago. It happens every 3 years. The United States didn't even break the top 20. That's your fault. That's your fault. It is your responsibility to come to school, to learn, to make a chance for your life. That's your responsibility. It's difficult for me to understand how someone can come to school and get an F. Because if you came to class and sat there and just sat and listened, you should get a C. And if you did your homework, you should definitely get a B. And if you pass at least 4 exams, you'll be surprised what you get. Voting. Guys, please vote. Because too many people have died for the privilege to vote. Let's put it this way. Ladies, do you realize it has been just 80 years ago, 85 years, since women had the right to vote? Prior to that time, only men could vote. Now, African Americans, how long has it been? How long has it been since African Americans in the South could vote? Anybody? 60 years. My father voted just one time in his life. Just one time. One. Daddy was born in 1909. And he voted one time. My uncles served in World War I and World War II and never voted. Talk about the next generation. Guys, it's important to take care of your parents, because they're the ones who really put you out here. And if you plan to do anything that's different from what was going on during the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Movement set up all of the things that you are enjoying right now. All of the things that you're enjoying right now. All of the things that you're enjoying right now. So learn as much as you can from your grandparents, your great-grandparents. Talk to them about what was going on during this time. Hear their side of what was really happening. Some of them is not going to be much different than what I'm talking about right now, because I lived it. I have seen it. I know what it feels like. I know the mental preparation it took to walk down the street and have to step off the side of the street because that was Jim Crow. I could not walk on the same side of the street that a white walked on. That's, and we call this whole concept, I call it, this is me, call it brain drain. If you don't learn what they know, you're going to have to relearn it again. And guys, we only have 72 years to do it on an average. And some of you right now, that 72 years have been broken down to about 50. We have 50 left. And if you have children and really get into the world of just living, you're only going to have 15 years. For those of you that are sitting here now, 60 years from now, some of you won't be here. So what are you passing on? What did you pick up from the older generation? There's an old saying that says, there are 2 ways to learn. You can watch someone, or you can learn yourself. And there's a hot stove theory. That means that there's a hot stove over here, and you're watching someone that goes and put their hands on it and they say, ow! Now, you can learn from watching them, or you can go over and put your hands on it and do the same thing. So, learn from your ancestors. Learn from the older people around you. It doesn't have to be your parents. It can be someone else around you. Questions and answers?
All right, actually, we'll give him a hand for that. Appreciate it. Anybody have any questions? I mean, I have a quick question I'll ask first. You said that your father, my grandfather, and your uncles did not vote. Could you explain why they didn't vote?
Well, in Jefferson County, Florida, they are still looking for those votes that kept George Bush II. And, you know, anybody remember what went on during that time? I know this is before your time. Well, there were certain laws that said that to vote, number one, you had to own land. And if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. Or if you had owned land, there was a test that you had to take to vote. Well, for black folk, it's a test that you had to take. And if you didn't pass the test, you didn't vote. And that's what one of the biggest reasons. Also, there was the Jim Crow laws that said you are not going to vote. And there were people who said, you're not going to vote. How many persons have seen the movie Selma? 1, 2. If you haven't seen it, see it. How many persons have seen the Rosa Parks movie? There's a scene in the movie where, in Selma, where Oprah Winfrey came, the person she was playing came and went to vote. And one of the questions was asked, how many senators are in the states? 2. And every question they asked, she answered it. And one question was, how many counties are in Alabama? 6 or 7? Name them. She failed, so she could not register to vote. And those were the kinds of things that happened with Daddy and the rest of them that kept them from voting.
Anybody else have any questions? Or anybody have any questions? There's one over there. Say it loud.
Were you involved in any of the, like, marches or any sort of...
Say that again?
Were you involved in any of, like, the marches?
Was I involved in any marches? No. You gotta understand that I'm a country boy. And I just did not like being here. The question I raised before was, what is the difference between what went on in Baltimore and Ferguson and New York? Most of you saw this on television. Well, there was those people who were rioting, and that happened only for a very short time. And then there was those who walked out and started protesting, saying, no, hey, no, we aren't going to do this. And the police came. The difference between then and now, the police were there, but there was those rioters who were whites, and most times they came with, not with 20 or 30, but it's like 500. And the police would just stand back and let them come at you. And that was something that I'm sorry, I I can tell a lie. Oh yes, I was walking out there. No, I didn't. And in college, we couldn't because I was a basketball player, and if you went out there and you did something like that, you could be kicked off the team. So I didn't.
Yeah, anybody else? Just one in front.
You did mention that Jim Crow laws are still existent today. I was curious in what ways they do exist today.
Very good question. That is an excellent question. On the books, it is not the same. But because of 400 years of being mental condition, remember the little boy was dropping his head doing this? There are people who grew up during that time, still have some thoughts in their minds about what they can do and what they can't. And the same thing is true with certain faction of that population who feel as though they can do anything that they want to. And 9 out of 10 times they will. Even though it is subtle, it is still there. It's still there.
All right, anybody else? We're getting ready to go to lunch in just about 5 minutes.
I
Anybody?
have another question.
Sure.
In the most I was read, it's with between African Americans and white, but did Jim Crow laws also affect other minorities like Hispanics or other groups that aren't white?
That's a good question. Did everybody hear it? Okay. The question was, is there any other groups like Hispanics and
Other minorities.
other minorities that was involved? Well, for Jefferson County, there were very few Hispanics. They were Afro-Hispanics, meaning that many of them came from Cuba, and they were there, they worked on farms, and so that, just take a look and see that there was a difference in individuals. No. If there were Hispanics or any other culture, and I remember there was a lot of Jewish Americans that were there, they took the role of being white, so they didn't have to deal with
Speaking of elections, 2008 was a very historic one for America. Can you describe how it felt to witness the first African American president?
Yeah, that's one that I will always remember, and I have a tendency to write down and write stories about it. I remember when it happened, I couldn't believe it. Even though it happened, I couldn't believe it. The first thing that I felt was, man, I wish Daddy was here. I wish my uncles was here. I wish there were others who were around who went through all of the agony during the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, who said, that's not going to happen. It will be generations and generations before it happens. But I felt very good. And to be honest with you, sometimes now I sit back and I say, did that really happen? But it felt very, very good. It felt very good. Yes?
What do you think, after being exposed to our generation, what do you think people's mindsets really are going to have in the future? Do you think that people will really treat others as equals, or do you think that there will still need to be some progress?
I think it's going to get better, but that depends upon you. And Mr. Houston made a comment this morning in the first group that says that it's left up to you. It's left up to you. And he said that, I know we're breaking for lunch. Mind if I sort of do what you said? When you go to lunch, you segregate yourselves. when you walk in, just look around and you're going to see faction here, faction here, faction there. You're doing it to yourselves. And he made a comment this morning that to keep that from happening, you go over where that group is and just start sitting down talking to them. Because you will learn something about them. And lights have a tendency to congregate with lights. So try and just break that. It's up to you to break that. I think it's going to happen, but it's going to be up to you to do that.
All right, I appreciate you.